thank you all for joining us today. This session is titled Amplify Your Organization's Voice Through Modern Marketing and Communications Best Practices. Iacocca famously said that you can have brilliant ideas, but if you can't get them across, your ideas won't get you anywhere. This panel brings together experts from the field of communications to share best practices from the marketing communications industry to help nonprofits communicate effectively to your audiences. We're going to cover what makes a good story, how to navigate tricky topics like politics and race, and modern messaging techniques. I'm Stephen Wong, and I serve as a Marketing Communications Committee Chair for the 1990 Institute, and I'm an advertising executive by profession. The 1990 Institute is a nonprofit that creates and supports educational programming and mobilizes collective leadership networks to improve mutual understanding, promote a constructive environment for US-China relations, and champions a fair and equal treatment of Asian Americans. Our website is 1990institute.org. The 1990 Institute is also sponsoring a $50 Amazon gift card for all attendees of this session. If you're viewing the recording, you can also enter by visiting our virtual booth and submitting your name and email via the I'm Interested button. Our drawing is on September 20th. Now, I want to introduce our four esteemed panelists. Stephen Gong is an Executive Director of CAM, the Center for Asian American Media. The website is caamedia.org. Most recently, he was a producer of the landmark PBS series, Asian Americans. It also happens to be airing on the other time slot right now, so we're very lucky to have him on this panel. Stephen also sits on the advisory board for the 1990 Institute. Robin Kim is a PR expert, hi Robin, and the global chair of Rudderfin's Technology and Innovation Practice. Rudderfin is one of the largest independent PR agencies and is dually headquartered in China and the US. Their website is ruderfinn.com. She also serves as regional board chair with UNICEF USA. We have Brian Wong. Brian is joining us from Shanghai. He's a founder and chairman of Radii, a multimedia platform dedicated to amplifying the voices of young China to the world. Their website is radiichina.com. Brian previously served as a vice president with the Alibaba Group, where he worked for nearly 2 decades. He's also on the board of directors for the 1990 Institute. And Heidi. Heidi is a chief campaign officer for the Ad Council. If you remember the public service announcements like "A mind is a terrible thing to waste" for the United Negro College Fund, or "Friends don't let friends drive drunk," Smokey Bear, and "Love has no labels," you've seen Ad Council campaigns. Their website is www.adcouncil.org. We do have a question and answer segment today, so drop your questions into the questions box. Now, to get started, we're going to start by talking about how we tell stories. So I'm going to play a video for you to get us rolling.
I've heard people make comments like, "Thanks for bringing the virus over."
Didn't it come from you guys? A passenger told me that I should go back to China.
I've had strangers cough at me.
People move away from me.
Someone spit 3 times towards my direction. I felt so violated. My biggest fear is that all the stereotypes that we've worked so hard to break are just going to be reversed. And I won't let that happen.
Everyone has to keep everyone else safe.
We all have to play our part.
I've been spending 8 to 10 hours a day making masks.
I donate my plasma.
As an essential worker, I'm delivering food, groceries for my community.
I mean, I know I'm putting myself at a little extra risk. I'm happy to do it.
It's really hard to talk about racism when all I want to do is cry about it.
You have to talk about it to other people. You have to tell them these things exist.
We're all human.
I'm a firefighter, not a virus.
I'm a mask maker, not a virus.
I'm a nurse, not a virus.
I'm a delivery woman.
I'm a rideshare driver.
I'm a chef, a neighbor, artist.
Bus driver.
I'm a doctor.
Fight the virus. Fight the virus.
Okay, some heavy stuff. Heidi, I'm going to start with you. Do you want to tell us a bit more about this campaign?
Sure, and it still just touches my heart so deeply every time I see it, and I've seen it a lot. Just for context, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Ad Council, we're a nonprofit organization, and we like to say that we're really where creativity and cause converge. And we do that by using the power of communications to really tackle the most pressing and urgent issues facing our country. Our initiatives are designed to change social norms, deep-seated attitudes and behaviors, and in many cases, save lives. And the motto is really driven by convening and engaging the incredible passion and talent that lives within our industry, being the media, marketing, and advertising world, who really want to use their superpowers to drive impact and really make a difference, particularly, in the world that we're living in today. And I think it goes without saying that the last 6 months have been incredibly difficult. We're in the midst of an unprecedented crisis, balancing both a global pandemic with widespread systematic racial injustice. And the good news is the Ad Council was really built for moments like this, using storytelling, using narratives to bring our country together, to remind people that above all, we are all human and really have to self-reflect. And I think we all know that the pandemic triggered, a terrible increase in racism, scapegoating, and bigotry and hate crimes, particularly towards the API community. And right around the time when we launched this campaign, it was reported that over a third of Asian Americans were reporting that they were victimized. They were, the brunt of racial slurs, jokes, and in many cases, real hard hate. So for us, it was important to use where we sit in this industry to get a message out, to really dispel these misconceptions and really give people something to think about, to really open their hearts, open their minds through storytelling. And we're hoping, that this campaign will do just that. But importantly, at the end, there's a real call to action that's designed to give people a meaningful way to make a difference, on an issue that really strikes a chord with so many.
And Heidi, the Ad Council has been doing this for many years now. What's the thinking behind using storytelling to affect social change?
I think because it creates empathy. I think, storytelling creates a narrative, it creates perceptions. And, during this time, telling human stories, and I think you saw just a snippet of it in that 60-second video, but there are also shorter cut downs where you just hear people that are completely relatable. It could be your neighbor, it could be someone in your community, it could be your friend. And I think that's the way that we really use storytelling to create that human connection, to just show people that you have to have empathy. And importantly, if you really care, you have to do more than just care. You can stand up, you can say something, you can do something. And we think these stories, in and of themselves are incredibly powerful and touching, and importantly, really relatable. I mean, everybody's going through this pandemic together, and then to hear stories of people who are out there, giving of themselves to others, and yet they're on the receiving end of just some horrific hate that's just unacceptable. And we want people to just feel that level of this is not okay, and stand up and do something.
Thank you for doing that. And in a second, I'm going to ask Stephen to weigh in as well. But I want to reiterate a point that you're making, which is that connecting with people at this emotional human level is the pathway that you're taking, as opposed to using statistics or maybe harder messages around policy. And that's not to say Ad Council doesn't do that, but there was a very intentional decision made to use a softer approach. And I'm going to turn over to Stephen to get his thoughts on that approach.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm not sure I understood the direct question on that, but in our work, I mean, I'm followed everything that Heidi said, and we're very much in agreement about the empathy. You know, we tell stories and give voice to the Asian American experience, and it's premised really on the importance of telling our own stories and bringing about social change through a greater understanding, really, of the authentic ways in which we make contributions, you know, to this society and this culture. And I think, you know, this is our 40th anniversary year. And I think the idea when we got started was a number of folks, you know, absolutely wanted to be or were filmmakers and wanted to reach the broadest audience possible. And that's always important. But I think there was a real frustration at the time because the gatekeepers, of course, in the industries would sort of say, well, there's not really a market, you know, for Asian American told stories. And we were frustrated by that. But I think, you know, you forge ahead anyway. And I think after this time, we really understand now the incredible importance of not waiting and of just being able to tell your story on all different types of levels. I would just say, you know, I'm so super impressed by that public service announcement we just saw, which tells an amazing story in, you know, such a brief time. So a lot of our work are long form documentaries, and we just did a series, The Asian Americans, that was 5 hours, but even in 5 hours, barely scratched the surface, right, on the thousands and hundreds of thousands of important stories that are part of our history. So anyway, I think it's that full range. We need the long form stories and we need short, impactful stories.
And Stephen, you and I have talked about approaching social change through soft power. So using storytelling as opposed to other avenues. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, two things come to mind, Stephen. Yeah, for much of our work and for most of our history, our work is in public television. There's a nice alignment of the mission, right, to educate. And we find the documentary form on public television being of critical importance. And yet, at this time, most young people don't have even television sets. So we all have to figure out how to do an appropriate pivot to reach, you know, new audiences, reach the next generation. So I think it is very interesting that we now look to social media. You know, we're looking to a lot of new platforms. And one thing I'll say that became interesting for us, you know, we also do an annual film festival, and we weren't able to hold our live festival in May. And so we had to turn to this online space. And, you know, we were just not, we had to learn quickly, right? How to hold what is now commonplace for everyone. All of our virtual gatherings and meetings, webinars, Zoomcasts, you know, whatever. And I find this an incredible new opportunity to utilize, you know, the mission-driven approach that we have to telling authentic stories and to create community through these stories, and yet be in as it were, a totally new communications form. So I'm very excited about moving ahead. And in some ways, you know, we're not just trying to get back to what the old normal was. I think the interesting thing on all levels of communicating deep and authentic stories, I think we see there are some new possibilities that are very exciting.
That's really interesting. I'm going to drill deeper into the topic of using Zoom because we have two conflicting needs here. The opportunity to use this new channel to reach much broader audiences than we could with nonprofits in the past, holding physical conferences, and the challenge of Zoom burnout. Are you seeing that nonprofits are able to reach much broader audiences now?
If that's addressed to me, I'll go first. I'm on a lot of Zoom calls. I'm kind of, I wouldn't say I'm burning out. I'm still, you know, this is all brand new. This was like when YouTube first started. I mean, I find I probably jump in on many different kinds of, you know, readings and performances. Just, you know, a little bit, we were promoting it among our staff for everybody to just kind of go wild, right? Tune in onto something and bring back, you know, what did they do well? How did they do that? So I think I haven't reached that saturation point. Right about now, I think this fall, there's going to be a whole bunch of film festivals online, a string of them. And we'll all sort of further learn, you know, how much of this, how much you can hold on to, and can you in any way replicate? You know, there's something that is so special about sitting in the dark together, you know, in a theater and watching the same work together, and the lights come up and you've all shared that. And I know that we end a good conversation on Zoom, and we finish it, and suddenly I'm in my bedroom, you know, alone. So, you know, we can't replicate everything yet. Still have to figure out how we do this right. But I really welcome hearing the other panelists' experience with this new territory of Zoom land.
Well, this is Robin. I'll jump in. I do have Zoom fatigue, guys, so I will admit it, and that is because a lot of my work, I'm living on the screen and we need to connect to colleagues. And so I think to what you're saying, Stephen, and Heidi also, what the campaigns that you create, you know, the quick answer is technologies like Zoom are really necessary, especially when it comes to connecting with colleagues that we can't see in person. We're also seeing it's a huge equalizer. Even events like this virtually in a physical event, we're actually seeing that people who might be shy about raising their hand and speaking up actually are. You see all panelists easily, so there isn't these hidden hierarchies. So actually, technologies like these are just a lot more participatory, and that's really important. And there's a lot of experimentation that is going on there. There's even new medium forms that are actually using Zoom. And at the same time, people need to see something, and the data shows this, and you all know, people need to see something 5 to 11 times to actually understand it, remember it, and to recall it. Mm-hmm. And that's important because, you know, when you see Asian Americans, you're not just going to want to see it on the screen. You want to talk about it with your friends and carry the message. You want to post it on social media, what Heidi had described with the ad council and doing it in different cuts so it gets out in different ways. I mean, human beings need sensory diversity. We need to see it, feel it, hear it, you know, taste it and touch it. And so I think a big part of storytelling is making sure that we create those experiences and we create those channels so that our stories can resonate from the way the audience needs it. So for Stephen, that may be for you, this film festival. And for Heidi, that might be for you in terms of this, but we all have different ways, and so do the people around us. So just kind of a quick note on Zoom and beyond.
But I think you touch on a really interesting topic of reach and frequency and using multimedia to reach out to audiences. So are you suggesting that our audiences, mostly nonprofits on the conference, should be creating content?
Yes, yes. And maybe even going back to even just the original note of storytelling. You know, all of us on the panel are professional storytellers, but the truth is that everyone in this room, everyone on the Zoom is a storyteller. We have all been telling stories long before we wrote them down. Okay, so in many ways, we are all content creators. And so I think that the takeaway for all of the nonprofits in this room is You need to create that content. And I think, Heidi, what you were saying, not just statistics, but people and emotions to bring that content to life is equally important. And to, you know, not entropically and not chaotically, but in a very focused and with intent, using the right channels and using across a number of different channels so that content gets out there and gets out there to the right people, you know, at the right time and in the right way. And yes, there's a lot of science behind that. And, you know, the best content is what makes it most important. It's what people share. It's what people comment. It's what people engage.
That's really interesting. And not everyone on the call might know what you mean by content. So I'm going to open this to all of you. What would you define as content?
There's so many different ways to deliver content in so many different forms. And I think, you know, underneath it, there needs to be some platform or some consistency of messaging, and then allowing it to be customized, you know, for each platform, I think is really important, whether it's a simple social graphic on your, you know, social media channels, or a story that the press is going to create, to a long form piece of film. You know, it can all ladder up to one larger narrative, but you really have to learn, I think, to be flexible and to know what you stand for, to understand what messages resonate, you know, to different stakeholders, and, you know, step outside of, you know, your own echo chamber too, and really listen to the people that you're trying to reach, to truly understand, you know, what stories can you tell that's really going to open a heart, get someone to think and actually behave differently, or engage, you know, with you as a nonprofit. And don't forget to ask people, you know, tell a story, but then if you want something, you know, be very clear, you know, don't leave people just feeling really, you know, fired up and, you know, passionate about your cause. You know, draw them in and be very specific with a call to action, I think is, you know, a really good thing for nonprofits to think about.
Does anyone have any examples of content that they've created or stories that they've come up with that they thought would work but did not work?
Yes. So before I was doing public relations, I was running a nonprofit. And, you know, and it happened to be for at-risk youth and for substance abuse prevention and intervention. And I was trying to put out a lot of stories about people that were impacted on the front lines, human beings, right? You know, and really highlighting an issue. And one of the things that I had learned was a lot of my stories were really interesting, but they weren't necessarily compelling because they lacked a couple of things. It's not enough to have an issue. I needed to have a point of view. And I needed to have a call to action that makes people, maybe they're not doing things like, say, donate, but they're thinking things in a different way. So I needed to do that. Another thing I think that's often a challenge for nonprofits in particular is what I'm going to call the burning platform. Why pay attention to this now as opposed to tomorrow or next week? And so part, I think, of making stories resonate is to find those moments in time, or those trends, or those, or just be able to tell a story in such a way that it can cut through that clutter and make people pay attention now. And so those were some of the lessons that I had learned. So what I do now when I'm working with individuals and organizations is try to find those ingredients. And sometimes it might not be appropriate to tell a story at the moment. Maybe we tell it during a time when there's a news cycle, like the UN summits that are coming up, or the anniversary of a major milestone, or if there's a trend that's happening now. So that's not to say that there aren't other ways of doing it, but those are just some examples of some learnings that I found that can make a story resonate more.
That's fantastic. Heidi, You talked about messaging, and Robin also talked about audiences. These are tools that we use in marketing communications pretty regularly, but I think it's worth talking about it here, a little explaining messaging and audience targeting in a little detail.
Sure. It's, I think, really understanding, who your audience is, really asking yourself, who is it that I need to reach? Because if you're everything to everybody, you are kind of missing the mark. You really have to, I think, as Robin said, have a point of view and have real clarity on your audience. And importantly, do your homework. Sometimes we want to get it done fast, and skipping that step of really truly understanding the mindset of the audience that you're trying to reach is of critical importance. And, sometimes nonprofits lack funding to do research, but there's so many tools around social listening. There are so many experts out there who are truly willing to roll up their sleeves and help. So think about just even expanding your own network to truly understand, your audience, the barriers, and then, what is the right message, and try and test stuff, throw some stuff out there in your social channels and see what works, and, be clear about what your, your goal is, and think about ways that you want to really measure it so that you can truly be effective and know when you didn't quite get it right, and take that learning and evolve your message over time. But really understanding, the audience that you're trying to reach, and having a clear brief that adds clarity to the core message and what you want people to do, are the basics of strong campaigns.
Ryan and Stephen, any thoughts on this? Do you use briefs? Do you use messaging platforms for creating your content?
Should let Brian. I'd love to hear from Brian first, and how he reaches, Then I have some thoughts.
Sure. Well, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, Radii actually, for those who don't know, is a digital media platform actually targeting millennial and Gen Z in the West and beyond. But the topic areas that we focus on are really related to what's happening in young China today. So in a way, I know this is an Asian American sort of nonprofit discussion. We have a slightly bigger challenge, which is, how do you traverse, these cultural boundaries to really help those, say, in the US, understand what's happening amongst the youth here in China. But I think that, our purpose is very similar to what everyone talked about earlier in this panel, which is really trying to share stories and trying to build empathy and understanding amongst our audiences, so that people understand that what's happening in China today, particularly amongst youth, is actually in many ways not that different from what youth are experiencing or thinking about or doing in places like California or New York. The interests in the issues such as Black Lives Matter, or the environment, wellness. These things are all things that young people in China care about and are trying to do and make efforts to really address. And so that's what we do at Radii. And Stephen, to answer your question about what sort of channels we use, we are very conscious of the fact that the young generation consumes media in a much different way. And so while we have a website, we essentially live on social media, Instagram, Twitter, occasionally Facebook, because you recognize even Facebook now is no longer the domain of the new generation. It's really different in emerging sort of media channels that are increasingly being consumed by the audiences that we try and reach.
I'll just add, for us, I think it's a continual learning process, trying to understand the best way, to tell stories of empathy and connection. And I would say, I've seen the nature of the Asian and API community sort of changing over these years. Used to be, of course, East Asians, Chinese, Japanese Americans, Koreans, who were the first to sort of have the opportunity to tell our stories. And then Southeast Asians, and in more recent years, the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, mixed race, you know, I find all of that fascinating, you know, all of it connected. And I saw a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I think it's really true. I think at this time of Black Lives Matter, you know, we can't help but try to think deeply about what is our role to play in breaking through so that we're not in silos, you know, and us finding our voice and having the opportunity to tell our own stories should not be at the expense of other communities that have lacked that opportunity. And I think we're excited about in moving forward, how can we identify and tell those stories? I remember, Stephen, the question you were asking is kind of research, and I wish we were that well organized, but no, it's kind of haphazard. You know, we have a pretty big network of independent filmmakers, and they come to us with stories. And the challenge for us in supporting a project is to sort of say, okay, is it a story we haven't heard before? And does the maker have a good take on it? Does he have access, you know, to tell the story? And that's what we're trying to develop there. I think you're on mute, Stephen.
Yep, I was. Thank you. So, Stephen, you mentioned Black Lives Matters, and one of the questions that we received is about how to address issues like BLM in a genuine manner, so it's not just performative. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Ryan?
Yeah, Stephen, I actually do have thoughts on that, mainly because at first blush, many people would wonder, you know, what does China have to do with Black Lives Matter? Mm-hmm. And this is actually a topic that we covered quite in depth on Radii, because number one, I think that was very interesting to recognize that the African-American community in China actually have a relationship that goes back all the way to early 1900s. There was a movement of anti-imperialism back at that period where China and the African Americans actually had a very common point of sort of cause, and there were exchanges between the communities, starting with W.B. Du Bois, all the way up to the 60s in the Civil Rights Movement. Between the African Americans and China. And so by exploring that history between these two communities, it actually brings a whole nother perspective to this dynamic between, say, Asia and, say, the United States. But most recently with Black Lives Matter, there's a big hip hop movement going on here in China as well. And we featured many of the hip hop artists here in China, how they responded to the Black Lives Matter issue in the United States. Some of the artists in particular were very outspoken about how important it is for Asians to take a stand on this and to voice their views because of what this movement represents to the larger community. And I think that was very interesting to highlight these common linkages, these common concerns for these types of issues. And as an Asian American, I grew up in California, and my family is third generation Chinese American in the United States. I think as Asian Americans, it's important to really draw the links as to why these movements matter to our communities, but also what our communities in the API community need to do to support one another. Because in a lot of ways, the Asian American experience today was greatly defined by the civil rights movement of the 60s, which is directly linked to the issues that we're talking about with BLM.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I saw Stephen and Heidi and Robin also wanted to jump in on that. Did you have anything to add?
Stephen, Heidi, you want to go first?
I'll try to be brief. Thank you very much, Robin. But yeah, very much as Brian said, you know, a lot of the historical documentaries we've done chart the many, many connections. You know, we did a documentary on the Chinese Exclusion Act that Rick Burns and Li Xin-yu produced. And what's amazing is that the Chinese Exclusion Act itself was a deal done, you know, between, and we see the connections to today between racists, you know, and a political deal where they could end Reconstruction in the American South following the Civil War and agree to pull troops who were trying to enforce Reconstruction in exchange, right, for voting on the Exclusion Act bill. So all of our histories in this country are based on that premise. And the only thing I'll add is, you know, that it gets to the notion, the fundamental notion of who are we telling these stories for. And in some ways, you know, you can say, well, we want it to be for everyone, but I do feel an extra responsibility, I think we do at CAM, that our own communities, we need to know our own histories. And particularly as the Asian American, you know, community has exploded in numbers in a way with the influx following the immigration reform in the 1960s, is that we had found that many newer communities of Asian Americans were not aware of the connection, the deep connection between other marginalized communities and our community. And we really think this is an opportunity, and it's important to connect back. And then finally, I'll add, I wanted to be able to say, you know, Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama, those of you folks who take Asian American studies, you know, these are important Asian American leaders in the civil rights movement, and they are really important figures and icons for us to hold dear. So, thank you.
Ready?
Yep. So, I mean, if I go back to the, you know, the question that was asked, you know, what does true, genuine allyship look like when it comes to marketing and communications? You know, I think it starts from the outside, you know, before we look at what we're doing externally. You know, I think in our industry, you know, there's a big drive towards diversity and inclusion and hiring practices within the workplace. And then it's looking at who's creating the stories and telling them, and really making different choices when it comes to creative, production, directors, filmmakers, you know, who's behind the camera telling the story, so that we do have, you know, the diversity of perspective and the opportunities, you know, there, you know, within our own companies, within our own organizations. And I think that's something nonprofits can do as well, you know, when you're bringing in you know, third parties to help co-create content. You know, it's really about walking the walk and then educating ourselves and taking action and really looking where we each individually can make a difference, you know, versus just making that statement.
Mm-hmm. This is a good segue, and we're already talking about the second topic, but I want to make it explicit. The second topic was about navigating tricky topics like politics, race, and equality in America. And a lot of our audiences, like many of us, are in nonpartisan groups. So what should we bear in mind, and what advice do you have for navigating such sensitive topics?
I'm happy to start.
Please.
If you like. You know, with our campaigns, you know, the issues are very complex, and, you know, the environment is highly politically charged. And I think, you know, as a nonpartisan organization, you know, you really have to look at the cultural landscape and the context for your message. And I would say, you know, a good example to draw on for us was, you know, when we look at the elections, you know, in 2016, you know, it was a very heated, divisive time in our country. We were very divided politically. There was a lot of racial strife. We had police shootings. We had calls for walls to be built. But, you know, we had a message to be told through our Love Has No Labels campaign. And, you know, if you stick to the facts and look for the right context, and you look at the messenger, you know, you can thread the needle very carefully. And we put out a piece of content that you all might want to watch that was delivered by John Cena. It was called We Are America. And the idea there was we used, July 4th to redefine patriotism in this country, redefining love of country as love of the people who live there. And by the way, we are a very richly diverse country. And it was a call to action to just really take a look at who makes up this great country that we all love. So it's really, looking at the cultural landscape, thinking about the message that you really want to get across and trying to find different voices to deliver it and do it in a way that really rises above, the politics versus diving right into it. If that's helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe just jumping in and just echoing Heidi is, since we all saw the Love Has No Labels as a start, right? I think one of the things that I think straddles that line so well is, yes, there are heroes, yes, there are villains, yes, there are so-called victims, but at the end of the day, there's a common value that unites all of us. And there's a common stake that we all have in the outcome. And making sure that that is an inherent part of the story and of the message is how one can find that balance in a, when you are nonpartisan or bipartisan. And I think a good example of that is UNICEF. I do a lot of work with that one as well. And, you've got congressmen on both sides of the aisle. So when we are on the Hill advocating for UNICEF, we have to make it real. And by the way, even we have to make it really clear that children is everybody's priority. So finding calls to action and values that we can actually all agree on and align is helpful in finding at least a common place where people are receptive to the solutions. There's a lot of road for disagreement. So you have to begin with something where the audience will be at least willing and receptive to listen. That's not always easy to do, particularly in this environment where so much is politicized, where, sometimes it feels easier to score points, than it does to create dialogue. And some of the conversations that we're seeing out there inherently have disparity built in. And so I think that the other part of then that is, but if we can show people where common values unite us and where a common stake in the outcome means everyone wins or everyone loses, that helps. And then on issues where it's a little bit more challenging to do that, a couple of learnings that I've seen just with the companies that we work with is first, we have to be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. Race, inequality, anything that we believe in that's inherently emotional is also inherently uncomfortable. So we have to be just comfortable being in that world. That's part of the larger conversations we're seeing today. Finding those values. And then also accepting that we also live in a world where a lot of issues that used to be really non-controversial just are. And in a consensus-driven world, particularly with nonprofits and NGOs, that can be really difficult. And sometimes it's accepting that we are going to have opposition built in. And we're going to disagree, and people are going to come against us. And we have to be okay with that. And the goal isn't to antagonize it and to do it. The goal is still to find that common ground, but accept that it's not going to be a 100% message. And that's okay. There's opportunity in that.
Fantastic.
Stephen,
yes.
Sorry, very, very quick. So, thanks, Stephen Gong. Look, I want to I echo what everyone has said, but also I think we live in a very challenging world where media now is punctuated by, quick sound bites, and we're essentially consuming sugar cereal when we should be eating whole wheat, bran flakes. This is a very challenging time to get people's attention. And so that's why I think a lot of what's happening, whether it's clickbait or just extreme headlines, is driving us towards this polarization. When you're dealing with the challenging issues, I think that that's what many of us have to confront, particularly in the media space when we're trying to communicate to the same audiences. How do you grab their attention? So I think one of the things that really resonates with me with what people have said is that you have to appeal to the hearts now more than the minds. And so when you are sending a message, you have to figure out a way to access the heart and then show to them, what are these universal principles, while at the same time helping people to open their own minds and think about what is my position on this vis-a-vis, the content that we provide. And so I think that it would be the most enriching, the most constructive way to address this issue, but it's not easy. And so whether it's the form of media, whether it's the way you present the message, I think that ultimately what you want to do, especially from our points of view, is provoke the thought and the thinking around that issue, but not overdo it in terms of the sugar, because otherwise you'll drive that polarization even further.
Yeah, well said. I agree with all of those. The only small thing that I was going to add, I mean, who could have imagined 3.5 years ago that we would need to somehow be equating white supremacy, with as being a valid political view, that one needs to respect and balance with a call for full participation and civil rights for all, and in the importance of diversity in the country. So it's been a real eye-opener. But working as we do, with public funding, one of the things I guess I would say is it's really important at times to find the will and the way to move forward. As Heidi said, find the basic facts so you can base it on some real things, but don't get into the game of self-censorship, of just like putting your head down and sort of saying, it's probably better we don't get into this topic. I would just say as an example also of something that I have seen and believe in, that our stories are so important because they can bring about social change that legislation or public policy can't. If the culture shifts as it has for same-sex marriage or transgendered communities, and it's moved so much faster in a sense than public policy did, that really to me underscores how important insightful, smart storytelling can be. If you can remind people and bring about that sense of empathy and connection, then I think it opens the way for the kind of social change that we know is necessary.
Indeed. Indeed. I'm just looking at the time and I'm realizing we've moved through pretty quickly. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and read some questions from the audience members. Okay, so one question we have from Wong is this. Andrew Yang says, and I agree with him, that Asian Americans are often perceived to be insular, caring about their own communities and willing to fight for their own rights. But how to overcome such insularity? I hope you agree that it's important to tell authentic stories that amplify the importance of racial, ethnic solidarity and common interests with Blacks, Hispanics, and the white population. How would you suggest Asian American community groups do that? That's a good topic. How do we speak as all of America?
If I could, I'll just get it started. One of the things, after the George Floyd murder, we were all kind of in shock, and then sort of we knew we needed to think deeply about this moment. So a couple of things, and maybe you observed this too. I was completely blown away by the way that young people, Gen Z, really stood up. I mean, of all backgrounds and communities, really stood up. And I had not seen this before, not in Ferguson and not in Rodney King, and that was really deeply moving. And I think what followed up quickly, this is what I want to say, is so many dozens and dozens of Asian American community groups that we know of, they all started coming out with the most wonderful, beautiful statements of support. And it was really heartening and it was really important. So, we have done our own also, but not with the sense just of that it's a pro forma thing to do. But this is a really an inflection point, I think, for the Asian American community. That so many organizations, as we're given the lead in a sense by our the youngest members in our community to really step up. So I feel really good about what the state is. I think this conference here, I think there's not just this feeling that that we need to unite just for the Asian American community to be able to move forward. It's really about saying, what is this country about? What is our best way? Well, we need to organize ourselves so that we can help all communities, and indeed, you know, the white community, as it were, but help America be this exceptional place, right? Where your character, where access and equality is really enshrined. So I won't go on. I know you guys feel it too, but it gives me some good heart that it had to get so bad, in a sense, for us to really see the need to pull together like this.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Well, I just say that, you know, in my earlier careers, I spent a short time in city politics and worked for the mayor in San Francisco in the 90s. And my responsibilities were Pacific Heights, Chinatown, North Beach, and the Marina and Richmond, I think, those different areas. And I'd say within those areas, there was quite a bit of diversity, although San Francisco has even more diversity than those districts, you know, sort of mentioned. But what I saw really in that experience, and as we did, you know, campaigning during the election time, I saw something very unique, which I had never seen just as a kind of normal working person or a student, which was this coming together of people of all backgrounds, all races, all sort of, you know, beliefs, you know, working towards a better system. And I think that's what makes America so unique, living here in China for so long, that this system allows itself to be constantly improved. And the Black Lives Matter and the issues we're dealing with now almost sort of tear the Band-Aid off of a wound that's been with us for so long, but it gives us an opportunity to come together and say, how are we going to make this better? And so I would say that, yes, conferences like this one that we're in today, but also the dialogue, I think Robin was talking about having those difficult conversations. I think this is that opportunity. And if we can lay the context, and somebody in the chat group was talking about culture first and policies, and I think you could say it's culture and values first and then politics. That's the foundation of everything that we see at the tip of the iceberg is your culture and your beliefs and what you hold important. And what we need to get back down to is really, what is it that binds us as a community? What binds us as Americans? And what can we do to improve the system, which then should be reflected in the policies? And so this is that opportunity. And this is why we all need to kind of voice those authentic views, share those beliefs, and then come together and find that common understanding. And I think that would be the bridge to bringing together the right and the left, or, you know, the conservative and the progressive, because it is possible. And we have the system before us. We just have to use it effectively.
I definitely agree with that. The comment you quoted from Kabir was that culture leads, policy follows, is really compelling. And that's also why the topic of storytelling can be so critical in shaping that culture. I'm going to go to another question from Christian Anisiete. Christian says, what would you say to disillusioned folks who have endured so many crises in their lifetimes, including 9/11, the 2008 recession, wars, and now the pandemic, civil unrest, and wildfires sweeping across parts of the country, and may struggle to obtain basic needs, pay their bills, student loans, and attempt to raise a family? How do we build up resiliency and address the needs of this generation that has been through so much trauma?
I mean, I would just say, and it may be obvious, you know, the whole conversation around mental health in this country has to change, and it is changing. And I think so many people are going through so many of, not necessarily the same struggles, but a shared experience, you know, through the pandemic and the fallout, which is very different, but very real for so many people. So I think, you know, learning to really accept that it's okay to not be okay and to reach out to each other and know that there's so much support, you know, within your network, you know, hopefully within the healthcare system, if that's what you need. But I think, you know, we have to start having conversations more regularly about, you know, mental health and well-being to start to build that resiliency. And there is hope. There's definitely hope.
Wonderful.
And this is maybe a macro as a complement to the micro. And I don't know if I would frame it that way, but the stories that I think we all remember are often the stories where the person has struggled and that we've identified with that struggle. And whether that ending is a happy ending or a hard ending, how the hero or the victim or whatever deals with that struggle tells us as much about who we are. And that is every story. And so I think, you know, and in many ways, human civilization is a story of how we struggle and hopefully how we overcome. And I think that's another reason why we are all here. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be disillusioned. And that's not to say that we shouldn't feel fatigue. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be skeptical. Yes, we should. But we are all here because change is hard. And if we can take hope in what that struggle means and knowing that it is worth it, that helps. And that is why the stories that tell us of those struggles, whether it is Romeo and Juliet, or whether it's the story of George Floyd, or whether it's the story of the Tate family in Stephen's first episode on their fight against education to get into a school that was formerly white, or any of our own personal stories, that's why we're here. So it's worth fighting for.
Thank you, Robin. So we're coming up on the hour. We still have many more questions that we haven't answered. And thank you for those questions. And you can see attendees saying, thank you, Robin. Thank you all for your inspiring stories. I want to end by asking each one of you to answer this question. For the kicker, what stories do you think we should be telling about ourselves in the future? Heidi, do you want to start?
Sure. And I think just to answer it shortly, you know, that during these extraordinary, unprecedented times, you know, we did demonstrate true empathy and true understanding and put shared humanity above all.
Beautiful. Stephen, do you want to go next?
Sure. But it's here on that. Yeah, I think we're actually involved in producing certain stories now about, you know, different parts of the communities, a lot of the first responders and things like that, essential workers, and I think each of us has our own story to tell about how we made it through this. You know, I just had a grandchild that was just born a couple of days ago, and I was reflecting with his parents about what an extraordinary year to be born in, you know, and the stories that this child will carry as they go forward. Hopefully, it will be a special, an incredible time when we faced so much that was so terrible and challenging, and yet we've come together stronger and more connected. So I look forward to that.
That's a good story to tell. Brian, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think we need stories now more than ever. I think we need to inspire hope in the communities around us. And I think for us as storytellers, we really need to think about what is topical, timely, and targeted. And we need to tell stories that matter to people at a time and a moment where we've got their attention. And we need to be very clear as to who we want to communicate to, because whether we like it or not, you know, my parents read and consume different media from what I do, and my kids are going to be a whole nother generation of media consumers that are going to use platforms and media that I've never heard of. And so I think that is critical if we really want to get our messages and our stories out, that we pay attention to these three things.
Very helpful. And lastly, Robin, we will close with you. What stories will you tell?
Wow. I would say in support of what Stephen and Heidi and Brian were saying, the stories that I want to see are stories about API individuals and communities that resonate not just with API communities and individuals, but are stories that the world sees are relevant to all of us. That's why we've all identified with Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or Malala or others. It's because we recognize the power of those stories to go beyond. And the API community has millions of those stories. I was just reading not too long ago about Dr. Feng Shanho. He is the Schindler's List of Chinese diplomats. That's what Hidden Figures was for everyone. So without going on and on, we have millions of those. And I think that we can be empowered to find those, to think in that way, because when we speak within our category and beyond our category, those are the stories that matter to everyone. And I think we have them.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that brings us to a close. Thank you to all our panelists and thank you to all our guests. If there are any follow-up questions from the guests, you can feel free to email us at 1990 Institute. Our email is contact@1990institute.com, and we would be happy to answer any further questions. So with that, thank you and have a great evening or a great morning wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.